I'm running on fumes a little bit this morning. It's been a very, very busy week for my family. Clark's basketball team is in state, and so they've had basketball games, playoff basketball games all week. And actually Tuesday night they play for the state championship, so it's exciting. But on top of that, my kids were both in Beauty and the Beast this weekend. Yes, some here saw them in that. If you see Clark looking old and haggard, it's not because he lives in my household. It's because he was crazy old Maurice, the dad from Beauty and the Beast. But so we were out late last night, but it was fun. But I'm excited we get to be in Hebrews 11 again this morning. We started at the beginning of Hebrews 11. Paul starts with this statement, which he is fleshing out through these weeks of us going through these verses in Hebrews 11. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. For by it men of old gained approval. That there is full assurance that can be had for us. There is conviction, which is literally the word proof. There is proof of things not seen. And those things, the proof and the assurance that we can have is in the faith of people around us, in the faith of people throughout history. That is the evidence of things unseen. All that we are, all that we claim to believe, all the invisible realities that the truth of Scripture reveals to us is proved in the life of people, of you and I, in our faith. When people see unusual peace in our lives in the midst of the most difficult circumstances, it's proof, it's evidence. When people see genuine abiding joy that just continues and is not really based on circumstances. That is so different than our world, that this happiness that everyone's pursuing in our world, that is temporary and completely based on what's going on in the life. Supernatural boldness and courage. We talked about Nate Saint and Jim Elliott last week. When people see that, it's evidence of things unseen. When people see real love and forgiveness in our lives, unusual love, unusual forgiveness in our lives, it speaks to things unseen. I've been trying to not only look back at these historical figures, which we'll look at a couple more today, and look at their faith, but also some evidences of faith in our world recently. And I want you to picture this morning, I know this is a little bit of a morbid thought, but the person you came with this morning, I want you to take a look at them for a second, recognize who they are. I want you to picture that on Friday, someone came into your home and shot and killed them. I know, morbid, right? Now this is 2 days later. How do you feel about that person who did that? What's your response to that person who did that? I want to show you some evidence of our faith. We need audio there.
Back this morning with a special series, Finding Forgiveness, and we're hoping to shine a light on people who have triumphed over tragedy with an incredible spirit that will really inspire you.
Back in 2015, 12 people were shot during a Bible study at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Only 3 of them survived, and just 2 days later, many of the families somehow found it in their hearts to forgive the shooter.
A lot of us were trying to figure out how that could be, and for most of us, forgiveness would not come easy. So how did those families who lost so much Find that power, the power of forgiveness. I headed to Charleston to meet with 3 extraordinary women.
Police and emergency responders are on the scene at what police confirm is a shooting inside a church in downtown Charleston. That church is known as Mother Emanuel.
Felicia Sanders' beloved Aunt Susie was killed that day. So was her 26-year-old son, Tawanza, who had a lifetime of promise ahead of him. He worked 2 jobs and was a gifted poet. Polly Shepard survived that day as shots rang out, words from the shooter she will never forget. I'm going to leave you to tell the story. Jennifer Pinckney's husband, the Reverend Clementa Pinckney, was also among the 9 killed that tragic day 3 years ago. We watched you go through pain. We watched you on your knees. We watched you hug your community. And then we watched something that I feel like is a miracle.
We have to forgive.
Just 2 days after losing their loved ones, family members said they forgave the shooter.
And I forgive you. But may God have mercy on you.
Was blind, but now I see.
My goodness.
Wow, weren't they something?
My goodness.
I all hear Amazing Grace the same way, because that is Amazing Grace.
That was
They're
powerful.
personifying Amazing Grace.
They are something.
And who knew you had such...
Pretty amazing. It's you can tell by the reactions. That's obviously a shortened clip of that, but you can tell by the reactions of the reporters there that that they're at a loss. Like, how does that occur? Someone very, very close to you is shot and killed by someone who just hates them. It was a white guy who just hated black people, wanted to go and shoot him. 2 days later, seeing this guy and saying, I forgive you. And you can watch clips, there's longer sections of them speaking. They don't minimize their pain. They talk about the fact that they will forever lose this person that they love dearly. But I still forgive you. Supernatural, right? Beyond us. Evidence of the unseen, right there. We looked last week at a couple of other examples, historical examples of things that give us our assurance of our faith. We looked at creation. I hope maybe this week, after having talked through that, as you just kind of drove around, walked around, you reflected on the evidence all around us of our faith. In fact, as I was preparing some of this week in my home office, I was looking out my back window at all the green rolling hills behind my house and just in awe of who our God is as creator. We also looked at Abel's sacrifice, his better sacrifice than Cain, and how God was faithful to Abel in rewarding him for his better sacrifice, which speaks to us about our better sacrifice we have in Christ. We talked about this guy Enoch, who didn't experience death because he was pleasing to God. God took him without him having to experience death. And then he finished with this verse. We finished last week with this verse. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. That faith is the thing that pleases God. That there's lots of other things that we could list and go, yeah, God likes this, and God likes this, and God likes this, and God likes this. But really, he doesn't like anything, doesn't love anything that is separated from faith. Even the best acts, even the best goodness in our hearts, our best efforts to be good people, God hates that apart from faith. Faith is the thing that God has always been pleased with from the beginning of time. And we're going to look at some more examples of this pleasing faith that God had. Let me pray for us and we'll get into what we're talking about this morning. Lord, as we take a look at the lives of these people that are so far removed from us. It's been thousands and thousands of years since these people walked the earth, since they did the things that they did. I pray that you would help us, even though there's a time distance, that you would help us to see through their eyes, walk in their shoes a little bit this morning, and see their examples of their great trust in you and your faithfulness to them. And may that be encouraging to us in our own faith and our own trust of you. And may we get just a little closer to trusting you fully and completely with every single part of our lives. That thing in our life right now that each one of us has that maybe we're holding back, that we're not trusting you fully with. Lord, I pray that today would be the day that we just drop it into your lap and say, I trust you, because you are trustworthy. You have shown yourself to be that. I pray this all in your name. Amen. So verse 7, it says this. It says, by faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. Now, we talked last week about the historical accuracy of the Old Testament, that it truly is history by any real historical standard. It is history. In fact, it is the most reliable history we have of the ancient world by far. There's no comparison. The only reason, honestly, that modern-day historians question sections of the Old Testament, most recognize that it's pretty historically accurate. But of course, they can't take it whole hog, right? They can't take the whole account of history, and it's really only for one reason. They can't accept the supernatural, right? And there are supernatural accounts in the Old Testament of things that God did that are beyond nature. And so they can't accept that. So they accept certain parts of the Old Testament, but can't accept the supernatural. We, of course, can accept that God has been working supernaturally in history since the beginning. But one of the other ways, other than the fact that we have stacks and stacks of documents, like we talked about last week, that establish the historical accuracy of the Old Testament, one of the other ways you establish historical accuracy is to compare with other cultures of the time the events that are talked about in a particular document. And the flood is one of those things that is disputed in history because, of course, it is supernatural. The fact that there was a worldwide flood that actually was so much water that it actually covered the mountaintops, that seems ridiculous by modern standards because we haven't seen that. We've seen floods. We've seen devastating floods. But the most devastating floods we've had in America, and we've watched the news and we've been like, oh my goodness, when Hurricane Katrina came in and there were all of those pictures of the water damage that had come through New Orleans. Even that flood, which is the worst flood I can picture in my head that we've had here in America, even that flood, it barely reached the rooftops of houses. And we're talking about a flood that actually filled the whole earth and with so much water, it covered mountaintops. But here's the crazy thing. The Old Testament is not the only ancient document that records a worldwide flood. In fact, we have a number of ancient civilizations that recorded that there was a worldwide flood. Historically accurate. This happened. This really happened in real time. It's a historical thing. This is not some Marvel movie about some superhero, right? Some major, they do such a great job with movies now. They can recreate these massive events, This is not some story. This really occurred. And there was a guy. You can find this account in Genesis 6. So creation is around 4000 BC. So around 2400 BC, about 1600 years after creation, there's a guy that lived on the earth. His name was Noah. And there was actually lots of people living on the earth at this time. In fact, probably the good estimates, the lowest estimate that I'm willing to go with of how many people were on the earth at the time of the flood is probably about 750 million people. I think that's low, actually. I think it's very, very possible it's much, much closer to about 4 billion people on the earth. The earth was inhabited, fully inhabited. And Yahweh, God, looked at the hearts of men, and all he saw was corruption in the hearts of men. In fact, the word that's used in Genesis 6 for corrupt is the word that was used for like spoiled meat. It was rotten. They were rotten to the core. He looks at them, and he's like, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed in this creation of mine. I'm just going to wipe them off the planet. We're done. But there was one guy that Genesis 6 says he found favor in the eyes of Yahweh, a righteous man, blameless in his time. And he walked with God. The exact same phrase that was used of Enoch, that he walked with God. And this guy, he's like, I'm going to give Noah an opportunity to avoid this disaster that's coming if he will simply trust me. So he goes to Noah, and he says, Noah, you know what? I'm going to allow you to avoid this catastrophe. I'm going to allow your family to avoid this catastrophe, which his family probably were rotten to the core too. Noah was the guy at the time. But I'm going to let you take your family with you too. And here's the deal. I'm going to bring a worldwide flood. Now you got to understand, if we're in the shoes of Noah, listening to God say, I'm going to bring a flood that is going to cover the whole earth and is going to cover mountaintops. Had Noah ever seen anything like that? No. He had no reference point for that. He might have never even seen a regular flood, but he would have known what that looks like if he had seen it. That's a minor amount of water. You're saying you are going to flood the whole earth with a great flood that will cover mountaintops. What did that take from Noah even to listen to that and accept what he had to say? Took great trust in his God. But this was a God that he had walked with. He had lived his life walking with God, and he trusted him. So God said, I'm going to bring a worldwide flood. How do we know he trusted him? Because, verse 22, he says, thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. So he did. How do we know he trusted him? He did what God asked him to do. Well, what did God ask him to do? God asked him not only to believe that he was going to do this whole worldwide flood thing, but also that he had to do something for a very long time in faith, believing that this flood was coming. He had to build this thing. Now, this is not the real ark. This is a reproduction of the ark that actually currently exists in Kentucky. It's a theme park that was built by the guys in Answers in Genesis, which I want to come check this out one day. Anybody been here? Is it cool? Yeah, Mark's been there. It is a full-size reproduction of Noah's Ark. And Noah spent at least 55, probably closer to 75 years. 75 years. Cliff, how old are you now? 78. Okay? As long as Cliff has been alive, minus 3 years, he spent building this thing. Day after day after day after day, hour after hour after hour after hour, trusting in something he had no point of reference for. For 75 years, probably people looking at you going, what are you doing, Noah? You going on a little boat trip? You know, I mean, come on. What are you doing? 75 years. But he builds it slowly, methodically. He gets it built, all in trusting God. And he did it, it says, out of reverence, he prepared an ark. Out of respect for who God was, he built an ark. He respected God's warning. When we lived in Alaska, we lived about 2.5 hours south of Anchorage. And so, and Anchorage was really where most of the shopping was, so we'd do shopping trips up there pretty regularly. But what happened is in the winter, it was bad. It was cold, the roads were bad. That 2.5 hour trip turned into more like a 4 hour or 4.5 hour trip because the roads were just bad. And we did something, and everybody who ever traveled up to Anchorage did the same thing. We would pack our trunk with blankets, sleeping bags, water. Why would we do that? Everybody did it. But there's a reason why we did it. Because if we got stuck, we would be in real trouble. We respected Alaska winter because there were people who did not respect the Alaska winter, and many times those people died. It's happened. So we respected it. We took the warnings that other people told us when we got there. You got to take this stuff with you. Trust me. Noah respected God. So he lived his life building this thing, not knowing what it was going to look like when it got there. He was just faithfully following what God had for him to do. And then God came through on what he said was going to happen. And it might have looked something like this. This is a Hollywood representation of it, but might have looked something like this. There is audio on this too, Savannah. Sorry, I told you only one. What God said would happen, would happen. By the way, that's from a movie called Noah, which, if you want a historically accurate representation of the Noah story, don't watch that movie, because it's not. But it's pretty impressive, the little flood scene they have here. But in 2348 BC, 2348 BC, historical record has that God flooded the whole earth. He did it. Water came up from the ground. Water came from the sky for 40 days. The mountaintops were covered. What God said would happen did happen. And Noah, who trusted God, benefited from trusting God. That's the point. God came through on what he said was going to happen, and Noah benefited from trusting God, taking him at his word. The point on your handout is Noah trusted God when he was told about the future, showing us that God can be trusted with the future he's promised us. Noah trusted God when he was told about the future, showing us that God can be trusted with the future he's promised us. Some might say, and we might in our own hearts say this to ourselves, how can we really know that God is going to come through in the ways that he has promised to come through? Can we really know that? Yes, we can. How can we know that? Because of instances like what occurred with Noah. God always comes through on what he says he's going to do. We can be sure of it. He goes on, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. So Abraham, you can find all about what was going on with Abraham in chapters 12 through 25 of Genesis. Lots of detail in Abraham's story, but it follows a similar theme. Abraham's life follows a similar theme. Around 2000 BC, so about 400 years after the flood, a guy named Abram, his name was Abram, it eventually got changed to Abraham. When he was about 75 years old, so again, about Cliff's age over here, God came to Abram, and he said this. He said, now Yahweh said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse you. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So God makes some promises to Abram. He says, you know what? I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give your descendants a land. I will bless those who bless you. You're going to become rich, really wealthy, and well off. And those who bless you and give you good things, I'm going to bless them and give them good things. Those who do anything wrong to you, bad to you, intentionally or not. Actually, we have some instances of people having no idea they were doing bad to Abram, and still God was not nice to them. Anybody who does anything bad to you, bad things are going to occur for them. And every family on the face of the earth for all time will be blessed by you. In fact, all of us sitting in this room today are blessed because of Abraham and his seed. But this was not unconditional, these promises. It required something of Abram. These are great promises, but it required something. It required him to trust God enough to go forth from your country. See, Abram lived in this area called Mesopotamia, in a smaller area called Ur, although at this time he actually had relocated to Haran, and he's asking him to leave this area. Now you got to understand, in the ancient Near East, in ancient Mesopotamia, this was clan war time. There were families, basically the way things kind of grew up and developed over time is families would have some kids, and those kids would have some kids, and those kids would have some kids, and you would start to become this big family, and families would stick together because that's where the protection was. And as you got bigger and bigger and bigger, you would build a city for yourself. And maybe if you had enough resources, you would build walls around this city. And the reason why you did that is this family would come and prey on weaker families. We're starting to run out of resources, so I need to go and destroy your family and maybe take you for slaves and take all your stuff, and that would make us a little bigger of a clan. And this was the world of the ancient Near East. There were battles all of the time. And to stay in your city-state, in your city with your family, meant protection. It meant safety. It was insanity to consider striking out on your own, making your own way in the world. That didn't occur here. You don't make your own way in the world, you stay with the family. That's where protection and good things occur. And Yahweh says, Abram, you just need to start walking. In fact, I'm not even going to tell you where you're headed. It's not like you're going from one city-state to another city-state, and you just need to make sure you can get there and make sure robbers don't get you. It's just going to be a quick trip. I'm not even going to tell you how long this journey's going to take. I'm not going to tell you where you're going. I just want you to grab your family, your immediate family, and I just want you to grab some resources and just start walking. Imagine that God comes to you and he says, you know what, I would like you to fly over to South Korea, and I would like you to just start walking north. And eventually, you're going to get to this border, and I'm going to show you a way that you can sneak across this border and go into this place called North Korea. And then just start walking around North Korea. Right? Would you do this? Right? That's insane, right? We know what happens in North Korea, especially if you're an American, right? Things don't go well. This is insanity, what he's asking Abram to do. But he trusted God completely. How do we know that? We know that from verse 4. So Abram went forth as Yahweh had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. How do we know he trusted God? He did it. He stepped out into something ridiculous. God says, step there, and it's not going to go well unless God's trustworthy. And he goes, you're trustworthy. And he did it. He goes on, he says, by faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He finally goes to this area. God shows him where to go, and he goes to this area called Canaan. And Canaan, he has him look around. He's like, look to the north, look to the south, look to the east, look to the west. Everything you see here, this is the land that I will give your descendants. It's not the land God was giving to Abram. In fact, for Abram's life, he would live as a foreigner in a strange land. It was not his land. Canaan was not his home country. Abram became very, very, very wealthy, but he did not build a city-state. He did not build permanent housing. He lived in tents, and his family lived in tents, temporary dwellings, for his whole life, for Isaac's whole life, for Jacob's whole life, for his kids. They were foreigners. But Abram was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. See, what's unique here is that Abram had promises that he knew that he would never experience, because they were promises to his descendants. They weren't promises to himself. And he was okay with that, because his home country was not Canaan. He wasn't looking for a permanent dwelling in Canaan. He was looking for a permanent dwelling, and it's a heavenly dwelling. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. He goes on, he says, by faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven, in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. The first picture we get of Sarah, the first information we get of Sarah, is at the end of Genesis chapter 11, and we find out two things about Sarah. One, Sarah is Abraham's wife. And two, we learn she is barren. She cannot have kids. It is impossible for her to produce a child from her womb. Impossible. First two things we find out about her. Then in Genesis 15, Abram is promised a son, which makes a whole lot of sense, because if a great nation is going to come from Abram, he has to have a son, and he doesn't have a son yet. He has no kids at this point. So in Genesis 16, Sarah makes a suggestion, because obviously she can't have kids, that maybe if he takes her maidservant, then he can have a kid with the maidservant. Now, we get a little harsh in judgment on Sarah with this. This was completely normal. Completely normal. Happened all the time. If a husband and wife were married and there was no kids to carry on the inheritance, it was very, very common for the wife to offer one of her servants so that the line could be carried on. It made total sense in their culture. In our culture, we're like, that's weird. Like, don't do that, right? In their culture, totally normal. It wasn't a lack of faith that Sarah was doing this. In fact, it probably demonstrated some faith in that she knew God was going to do good things through Abram. And in fact, at this point, she had no information that it was going to be through her. So she offers her maidservant. That does not go well. Things are not good there. But then in chapter 18, a couple messengers from God come, and God tells Abram, no, that wasn't my plan. My plan was not for you and Hagar, the maidservant, to have a son. My plan was always for you and Sarah to have a son. Now, Sarah's overhearing this, okay? There's some problems with God saying this. One is, Abraham is 100 years old. 100 years old. In fact, in Hebrews it says he was as good as dead, right? He was that old. And I gotta say, I had this is gonna sound bad in some ways. I had a great-great-grandma who was still alive when I was younger. I think she lived to 103, Mom, is that right? 106. 106. And we used to go visit her, and she was a great lady, and it was really fun to go visit their house. They had an amazing house. She was a neat lady. But honestly, every time I saw her, I thought, man, she's as good as dead. I mean, she's pretty much, any day now, right, it's going to be the end. And she was thinking, yeah, I'm pretty much as good as dead, and things are going to... He's 100 years old. Problem. Right? Second, you got Sarah. She is 90 years old. That's no spring chicken, okay? She's 10 years younger, right? But she's very, 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 very old, way past the age of having any kids. Way past. In fact, there's some biological realities that would have already occurred by the time she was 90, right? This is no. And don't forget, what did we first learn about Sarah? She's barren. She couldn't have kids even when she was 30. And so she chuckles a little bit. She laughs at that idea. She's like, yeah, right. That's going to happen, you know. It makes total sense. The oldest woman to ever have a child on record actually happened just a couple years ago. A 72-year-old woman had a child. Yeah, we're like, wow. Actually, we're not certain she's 72 because it was in India and they don't have good birth records, but her husband said she's definitely 72. So we're going to go with 72. Regardless, she was really, really, really old, right? Oldest person on record. There's a handful of women, who have had children in their 50s. And they do every year, actually. A little handful of women in their 50s have children. But there's something true of all of those births. There's a reason why it's oldest on record now. It's because it's technology. They all became pregnant through in vitro fertilization, through this technology, right? None of them had natural pregnancies. None of them. Sarah's 90, barren, and promised a natural pregnancy. Well, supernatural, but. So she laughs. God calls her on it. It's like, why are you laughing? Is anything impossible with me? And at first she's like, oh, no, I didn't laugh. I don't know what you're talking about. No. You know, she's feeling a little guilty at that point. But God says, is anything impossible for me? And from that point on, Sarah was bought in. She did everything a pregnant lady does. She prepared. She went through the pregnancy and she gave birth to Isaac. God came through. And through Isaac, numerous, beyond counting descendants came from Isaac. In fact, there's this critical scholar. There's these guys who spend their time kind of ripping apart the Bible, tearing apart the Bible. They think that's fun for some reason. I don't know. But there's a guy. His name is Rudolf Bultmann. Very, very famous critical scholar. And he even, okay, this is not a guy who is going to hold to Old Testament historical accuracy. He said this. He said, the greatest proof for Christianity is the existence of the Jewish people, of Israel. And I agree. You've got impossible circumstances over thousands of years that keep this group of people as a unique, identified nation. And God promised that they would be a unique, identifiable nation of people. And you've had literally thousands of cultures in that time rise and fall. Even the greatest cultures on earth. And they're gone, obliterated off the face of the earth. You have this little group of people who still exist as a real people on the earth. God is faithful to his promises. And there's plenty of evidence of it. Plenty. So therefore, verse 12, therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of the heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. In fact, we don't know how many Jewish people have lived on the earth. We do not have a count on that. It is so many, and so they've been scattered throughout the world that we have no idea. But it is a ton. It is uncountable, like the stars are uncountable. Like the sands on the beach are uncountable. Because God is faithful to his promises. Point on your handout. Abraham and Sarah's lives demonstrate that God is willing and able to keep his promises even beyond our past experience or what seems logical or safe. Abraham and Sarah's lives demonstrate that God is willing and able to keep his promises even beyond our past experience or what seems logical and safe. I didn't talk about this implication, but imagine being 90 and being pregnant. In the ancient world, there's no hospitals. It's like a guaranteed death sentence. You're not going to survive that. But she trusted God and did. All right. Keep pushing here. Last couple points. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. So we have Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob. They never saw the nation of Israel. They never saw them coming into the land of Canaan, conquering the land of Canaan, and establishing themselves in the land. They never saw that. But they welcomed these promises of God. They saw them way off, like they dreamed, they imagined what it would be like. But in their lives, they lived as strangers and exiles in the land. Strangers means foreigners. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. So these strangers, these foreigners, these exiles, which is the word sojourner, it's a temporary resident. When they refer to themselves this way, that they are strangers and they're exiles in the land, it indicates something. That's not their home. Their home is somewhere else. If someone comes here and we say this is a foreign person, then that person is not an American citizen, right? That's why we call them foreign. They're a foreigner. And they might even say of themselves, I'm a foreigner. And you might ask, what's your home country, right? Because a foreigner means you're not living in your home. He goes on, he says, and indeed if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had the opportunity to return. If they were saying, I'm a foreigner and I'm an exile, but my home is Haran or Ur or Mesopotamia, if that's my home, if they were thinking that way, then probably, like any foreigner would, they would eventually return back to their home. But they weren't talking about Mesopotamia. They weren't talking about that as their home. He goes on, he says, but as it is, they desired a better country, better than Mesopotamia, better than Ur. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. These people are examples, or historical examples of people who lived their whole lives as foreigners, as strangers, because their home was a heavenly home. There's a clear application for us here, right? We are not U.S. citizens. Yeah, we're U.S. citizens. Okay, we are, right? But this is not our home. This is not our place. Our place is eternal. Our place is what's coming. We're going to return home. We're visitors, we're strangers, we're exiles in this land. Our home is the place that God has prepared for us. So the point of your handout is, many of God's promises will not be fulfilled until after our lifetime. But it is a person with this level of forward-looking trust that God is proud to call his own. Many of God's promises will not be fulfilled until after our lifetime. But it is a person with this level of forward-looking trust that God is proud to call his own. Last one. And I could talk about this one forever, but I'm not going to. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. Isaac, this one who had been born in this miracle birth to really, really old, barren people, the promises, all of the forward-looking promises, the future promises existed. He was the representation of that. They were all going to be realized through Isaac. All of God's promises, future promises, were in Isaac. His death, before he had kids, which he hadn't had kids yet, his death would have meant the destruction of all of those promises. God would not be able to come through on his promises if Isaac was dead. Abraham knows this. And God says, hey, Abraham, I would like you to go and drive a knife through the heart of your son, Isaac. I'd like you to go take his life, please. I can think of a million reasons to say no to that. It makes no sense, 0 sense, to take Isaac's life. Not only talking about how utterly impossible that is for a father to do that to his son by his own hand. I can't even fathom. I look at Clark, I can't even fathom considering that. Ridiculous. And Abraham says, I trust you, God. Fully, completely, where's the knife? And he plans it. Gets the wood together. This is premeditated murder. Walks him up the hill. Lays him down. His poor son is confused. He's like, what is going on here? This doesn't make sense. This is not adding up. Dad. Just lay down, son. And he goes to drive the knife into the heart of his son. See, there's a problem because most of us know this story. We read the story from the end, and we miss it. Abraham was killing his son. He was killing him. He was driving the knife into his heart. He was going to do it. Trusted God completely. And in fact, he goes on here, he says, he considered that God is able to raise people even back from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. He recognized that, you know what? God is so great and so big. I've never seen a resurrection. I don't even know what that is. I probably didn't have a term for that in my head. But I believe that God can do anything. There had not been a single recorded resurrection from the dead up until this point. He had no reference point for that. But he's like, you know what? God could do anything. Obviously, God is going to fulfill his promises through Isaac. And even though this is really, really painful to do this thing, God is going to be faithful because I know him to be faithful. And he went, yes, God did stop him, right? But that's not the point. The point is, he was willing to do whatever God asked him to do because he knew something. It wasn't out of some blind obedience, sure, whatever, I'll just do. No. He knew something that I need to grasp. God is completely 100% trustworthy with everything in my life. Everything. Point on your handout is Abraham trusted God so completely that he held nothing back from God. In fact, that's God's response. Man, you didn't hold anything back from me. This is evidence that there is nothing that you don't trust me with. Now here's where it gets real. Got real for me this week when I thought about this question for myself. What is my Isaac? What is the thing in my life that God is saying, step out here? And I'm going, that looks pretty squishy. I don't know if that. Which I'm really saying, God, you look pretty squishy and unreliable there. Really? May we look at Noah and Abraham and Sarah and go, God, you're trustworthy in every area. I don't want to hold anything back from you. I know I don't. Bottom of your handout says this. It's actually a repeat of last week. Biblical faith is on trial. A long list of witnesses have given their statements, and they are recorded for the world to see. As in any case, those who judge must weigh the credibility of the witness statements, but so many over such long a time have attested to the validity of biblical truth in their lives that the case appears to be on very firm footing. It definitely is. All of the evidence has been submitted to render a reasonable judgment. Everything that the people of God have hoped for and every unseen reality of Christianity has ample proof in the lives of generations of believers who have placed their faith in our God and not been disappointed. As in any case, there's a possibility of someone making a final judgment that is in direct contradiction to the facts, but those kind of decisions have little to do with the evidence and much to do with their own biases. How good is the evidence of faith in your life? This is not a call to fake it. This is a call to trust him more completely. And what are one or two lessons that God is showing you or reminding you of this morning? I'll give you a second if you haven't filled something in there to do that. Lord, we are so thankful for these examples of faith. Lord, not examples that you intend for us to look at and think, oh, that's nice. That's nice that these superheroes of the faith existed. That's not why you have recorded these for us. You've recorded these for us as proof, as evidence of your trustworthiness, your faithfulness. Lord, may we receive these truths deep into our heart and start to trust you more and more and more with everything in our lives, to hold nothing at all back from you until we are completely and utterly dependent upon every word that comes from your mouth. Cause us to be individuals that operate on that kind of trust in you. Cause us to be a church body that operates on that kind of trust in you. Pray this all in your name.